Bill, I'm going to tell you the story of my grandfather, which would be your great-great-grandfather, his life and how he was killed by the Indians. When I was a young man, a very young boy, probably about 8 or 9 years of age, we went down to Uncle Peter McBride's place one evening, the family did, and after we'd had supper with him, and after supper we sat around and was telling stories. And as I remember Uncle Peter's telling the story, this was how it went about Grandfather Ferrin. Grandfather Ferrin, of course, was born up in Utah and moved to Pima with his family, leaving the 2 oldest children who lived up in Utah. They came in and they settled in Pima, Arizona, and of course at that time Pima was just a little brush patch, really. There's only a few houses there and very little town there. Very little farming, or just kind of a cow town is what it was. But in order to make a living, Grandpa was a freighter. He took his horses and wagon and went down to Bowie, to the railroad station there, and got a load of freight to go to Globe, down where they were mining copper down at Globe, Arizona. And he was coming back, and he was traveling with 4 men. Uncle Peter McBride was one of the 4 men in the group. I don't remember the names of the other 2. But as they were traveling, they came down through Pima and then on down to Fort Thomas, and then down to the San Carlos Indian Reservation. And when they got down to the Gila River, down on the reservation, they stopped and made camp. Well, during the day, Grandpa's wagon was the last wagon in the group of going along. He was bringing up the rear. And so when they stopped to make camp that night, they pulled the wagons in a circle, and they turned their horses out to pasture there by the wagons. There's a little grass there for them to feed on, and of course they had some of them hobbled so that they could catch them. And they just turned their horses out, and here come a group of Indians riding down and rode right in between them and their horses and drove their horses off. Well, Grandpa Ferrin had always been able to talk to the Indians up in Utah, where he'd been freighting before, and so he stepped out from behind his wagon to talk to them, and one of them lowered a rifle and shot him down and killed him right there. The other 3 men saw the rifle, and they said that it was his rifle. And they looked in the wagon later, and they couldn't find his rifle. It was gone. And so they figured that during the day, as they were traveling along, an Indian had crawled up in the back of his covered wagon and got up under the cover and stole his rifle out. And then that evening when they come through, when they made camp, the Indians come riding in, and this Indian used his rifle and killed Grandpa with his own rifle. The other 3 men, when they saw that the horses drove off, they knew that the Indians had come back after them, and so they went out and hid in the brush. And one of the men said that he was laying on his stomach under a bush, or under a bunch of brush, and he had his hands up over his head, laying flat on his belly with his hands up over his head. And one of the Indians' horses rode so close to him that he almost stepped on his hands, and he had to draw his hands back to keep the horse from stepping on him. Well, after a while, the Indians give up and decided they couldn't find him, and of course it was getting dark that evening then, and so they left him. And these 3 men made their way back to Fort Thomas to get some help from the soldiers there at Fort Thomas. But when they went in and told the commanding officer of the fort about what they had done, why, he told them to go on back and get their wagons, but to leave Grandpa out there and let the Indians scalp him. Said that way there'd just be one man scalped, and there wouldn't be an Indian uprising. But of course these men didn't like that idea. They wanted to take Grandpa back to Pima and bury him in with his family there. And so I'm going to stop here for a second. So they took a mattress and rolled Grandpa up in the mattress and put him in the back of the wagon and went on back through the fort. And as they came to the guard gate, the guard on duty asked him if they had Grandpa, and of course they denied it. But he went around and looked in the back of the wagon, and when he saw uncovered Grandpa there, why, he says, okay, go on through. He says, but if you get caught, it'll be your skin and my neck. And so they hurried on through the fort and got on up to Pima and took him back to Grandma, and they had his funeral and buried him there in the Pima cemetery. Grandma Ferrin lived on there in Pima with her young children. My father, Charlie Ferrin, your great-grandfather, was 1 year old when Grandpa was killed. So he was just a baby boy. And he grew up there in Pima, he and Uncle Billy and the other boys. Robert and Jacob took the team. Robert was 14 and Jacob was 11, I think. And they took the team on the wagon and went to freighting. Just the two young boys doing the same job that their father had done. And they freighted all over the country with that team and made money to support the family. And of course, as Grandpa and the other boys grew up, they began to take jobs and support the family. One job Grandpa tells about was when he was about 6 or 7 years old. They had moved in down to Ashurst, which is just a few miles west of Pima, and he took a job taking care of the cows for all the neighbors that lived down there. The cows would go out and pasture during the day, and they pastured down around the old Red Knolls, which is a barren flat down there now. But when he was a boy, the grass grew so high that the cows would get a little ways away from him and he couldn't see them. But he had a little old dog, and he said he'd hold that dog up over his head and he'd see the cows and he'd go yip, 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 and he'd put him down and he'd go running and get the cows and bring them back. And he kept them there and herded the cows, and that was one of the jobs that he did. Another job that come along just a little while after, he and Uncle Billy took a job digging mesquite stumps. That's the bottom of a tree out of the ground. They was clearing up some ground so they could farm it. And so they'd dig a hole around these trees, and then they'd take an axe and chop the roots off. And when they finally got all the roots chopped off, then they were too little to roll the roots out of the hole, but they'd yell at men that was going back and forth on their wagons and what have you up and down the road, and ask them to come over and help them roll the roots out of the hole. That was when they got paid, when the roots were rolled out of the hole. But they were too little to do it themselves, but they got the neighbors to help them, and that's the way they got paid. The neighbors would come help them roll the roots out of the holes. Grandpa Ferrin, of course, growed up there in Pima, Arizona, your great-grandfather. And when he was about 18 or 19 years of age, he worked in the Mutual in the church, and then he filled a mission down in Florida. He went down and spent 2 years working as a missionary down in Florida, and when he came back, he was some 20 years of age then, and so he worked around there on the farms and one thing and two, and finally he had a team of horses that he'd raised when he was a kid, and he traded the team of horses for a piece of ground south of Pima, and it was all grown up in mesquite trees, and he had to dig the stumps and what have you out of it and made a farm out of it. It's now called the Malum place down there south of Pima, and he farmed that piece of ground with one horse and a wagon, a horse and a plow and what have you, and grew a little crop there, a little grain and so forth. And after he'd got the farm cleared, well, then he traded it for another piece of ground and started in again all over again, clearing the brush and the trees out of it. And that's how he got started in farming. And now, by the time that he died, he owned, I guess, close to 300 acres of ground that he'd bought by just trading one piece of ground for another, and that was what he made a living for his family on.